What started out as a 5-year, $2 million project would soon turn into something unlike anything seen before. Burrowing through the twin-peaked Hoosac Mountain lies the 25,081-foot Hoosac Tunnel. Thousands of man-hours, dozens of deaths, numerous injuries, the tunnel soon obtained its reputation of the Bloody Pit. While the tunnel itself is known by train buffs and sightseers alike, the history of its importance has faded. Why was the tunnel so necessary? What hardships had to be overcome? Why was it considered the big dig of its day? Find out why Hoosac was known as the Great Bore. In the northeast of the United States, between North Adams and Florida, Massachusetts, lies one of engineering's greatest marvels, the Hoosac Tunnel.
The story of the tunnel would go back to an individual in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Alva Crocker, who was the owner of a paper mill in Fitchburg. He wanted to ship his goods to the west. At the time we're speaking of here was the early 1800s, when the major transportation system to the west was the Erie Canal. He wanted to bring the railroad from Fitchburg westward to Albany and meet up with the canal to ship his goods west. The only railroad at that time went from Boston to Fitchburg. There was another branch line of Boston and Albany, which about paralleled the route of the Massachusetts Turnpike, which meant that Alva Crocker, in shipping his goods west, would have to send them first eastwards to Boston, then all the way back across the state of Massachusetts.
Back in the early to mid 1800s, the railroad was becoming the mode of transportation for shipping goods and moving people. And the businesses along the northern tier of Massachusetts, Fitchburg and Leominster and Lowell, these manufacturing centers wanted to be able to ship their goods in a straight line across Massachusetts and into New York State, where they could connect with either shipping traffic on the Hudson River or with railroads that were going to the Midwest. And the Hoosac range of mountains blocked that. There was no way to get around them. They were too steep and too high.
Boston wanted its own connection to the Erie Canal and all the freight that would be coming via that route. They early on knew about all these rivers went across Massachusetts, that they could actually build a canal from Boston to the Hudson. But Hoosac Mountain was sort of in the way, and there was a proposal to build a 5-mile long canal through the mountain. The route was surveyed and it was deemed possible.
It would have gone up out of Boston on the Concord to one of the rivers, then down through on the Millers to Greenfield.
Followed the Deerfield River up into Vermont to Reedsboro, and then gone up the west branch of the Deerfield that runs from Hartwellville down to Reedsboro. They were going to use a series of locks to move canal boats and get around the mountain that way.
Theoretically, it would have been something similar to the Erie Canal. Of course, that 5-mile long bulk of Hoosac pretty well killed the idea. The state legislature decided they would pay Loamy Baldwin for his surveying skills and that was the end of the project, at least in terms of it being a canal tunnel.
In 1824 to 28, they built what was called the Blackstone Canal from Worcester to Providence, Rhode Island. And what that essentially did is all the agricultural and merchants could actually ship their goods from Worcester to Providence in a matter of 3 days. Boston became a dying seaport at that time. When you look at the topography of Massachusetts, the real problem was, how do you get your goods from Boston all the way to western Massachusetts? Ever since the 1600s, late 1600s, they always wanted to build canals because of one geological feature of Massachusetts, and that's Cape Cod. It sticks out in the ocean, separating Boston Harbor from the rest of the shipping routes. And in the early 1800s, it was dangerous for ships to actually go down and go around Cape Cod. That's why we got the modern day Coast Guard. They started down on Cape Cod because the shipping routes were too dangerous.
With this canal, ships no longer had to risk rounding Cape Cod. Rather, they could simply port at Providence, ship their goods up to Worcester, and hook into the railroad that way.
That left Boston in financial ruins. Industry started to die in Boston, and the merchants banded together to figure out what they could do. And as early as 1828, they proposed a railway, and that would make the canal obsolete.
A railroad was built through the southern part of Massachusetts, the Boston and Albany. Built a railroad that crossed the Berkshires in the southern part of the state, but there was nothing in the along the northern tier that would get around those mountains.
In 1848, they opened the first railway from Worcester to Boston. People like Francis Bird loved this because he was a Worcester paperman and he could actually capitalize on the railroad. What Alva Crocker was facing is he could get his goods from Boston, from the Hoosac Dock to Fitchburg, out to Turner's Falls, but how do you get it from there through the Hoosac Range and on to Troy?
The only logical way through the Hoosac Mountain Range? A tunnel. But tunneling would cost millions and take years.
But was a tunnel really necessary? After all, the Western Railroad, later to become the Boston and Albany, already had a line that ran the entire width of Massachusetts.
And there were other rail systems, such as the Aire and Worcester running down to the Western from the north, which the Fitchburg Railroad could easily hook into.
What it all boiled down to? Money. Why would you pay someone else to use their railroad? Especially when you can get others to pay to build yours.
This is where Crocker's political background came in and benefited him. Crocker pointed out issues such as if this railroad and the Hoosac Tunnel weren't built, the Western Railroad, being the only line to run the entire width of Massachusetts, would own a monopoly. This got people interested in building and funding the project.
Of course, he being a mill owner had the political finesse to get a bond issue started to build a railroad and a tunnel westward from Fitchburg and connect up with the rail lines in Albany.
In 1842, the Fitchburg Railroad, leading from Boston to Fitchburg, was chartered. Soon thereafter, in 1844, the Vermont and Massachusetts Railroad, leading from Fitchburg to Greenfield, was chartered. Then, in 1848, the Troy and Greenfield Railroad was chartered. This was to be the rail line to run through the Hoosac Mountain. They laid plans for this new railroad, coining the slogan, "On to the Hoosac, on to the West."
At the time Alva Crocker made these plans, the route was fairly well determined.
While the route in itself seemed simple enough, run a line westward from Fitchburg, through Greenfield, and up along the Deerfield River, on to North Adams, there remained one large obstacle, the Hoosac Mountain Range.
At its narrowest point, the Twin Ridge Peak was 5 miles from east side on the Deerfield River to the west side on the Hoosac River.
This meant that in addition to the rail line needing to be laid, there were 5 miles of mountain to burrow through. The longest tunnels to date in the US were only a few thousand feet in length. This one would be upwards of 15 times as long.
There was a proposal to build a canal, but the mountain prevented any such construction at that time. Now, Alva Crocker proposed tunneling through it. He did not know that he was confronting some of the hardest rock known, and that the equipment for building such a tunnel didn't yet exist.